want me? Oh, you started already? Oh, yeah. Well, I'm hoping to be a witness in this trial, just as they're being a witness to the convictions of a lot of us that the arms race are reducing American security. Of course, the Mark 12A warheads that they destroyed are directly intended to reduce the security of the Soviet retaliatory force. And it's a truth today that we can't really improve our own security at the cost of somebody else's security, because they have the ability to race us to buy their own nuclear warheads. They'll get weapons very similar to the Mark 12A. The arms race will go on. In fact, the first victim of weapons like this is the SALT process itself, is the arms limitation process. It ensures that other side will continue, that we'll have another round following this. And one price of all that is that other countries, seeing that the superpowers have no intention of upholding their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to stop the arms race and to reverse it, other countries will proceed to imitate us and get their own weapons, and that too will lower our security and everyone else's. So the Mark 12A is, of course, intended, like the MX and the others, to improve our security. The people proposing it are sincere about that. They're patriotic, but they're desperately wrong, just as many of the same ones were wrong in advising us and leading us into the war in Vietnam and prolonging it and escalating it. It wasn't their intentions, in some sense, that were at fault. No one wants to harm everyone on Earth. That's really what they're doing now, by using this same bad judgment in pursuing our own superiority of force with the certainty that the arms buildup will occur on both sides.
Why is our leadership so misguided?
Well, they're following rules that have served leaders for thousands of years, that you can't go wrong being too strong, that you can't be too strong, and that there's no better way to mobilize your country than in improving its military strength. Nowadays, when that assures that another country will be increasing its capability to attack us because the arms race is not cut off, when strength doesn't buy defense anymore, and we have no defense against Soviet missiles any more than they have any defense against ours. I found a lot of people don't realize that, by the way. They somehow think that all these warheads we're buying are somehow must be contributing to our defense against enemy attack. They don't really realize we have no anti-ballistic missile defense, because such a defense doesn't really exist. It wouldn't really work. More than that, people have the false impression that these warheads are intended at least to deter a direct attack on this country. But quite apart from these warheads, we have, and the ones that Reagan is about to buy, we've had far more than adequate retaliatory power to deter a direct attack on ourselves for many years. We've always had that. These weapons have nothing to do with that. They really have to do with deterring enemy or adversary retaliation to a U.S.-initiated use of small tactical nuclear weapons in a local war, backing up threats of a kind we've made a dozen times in the small wars, so-called, we've actually fought in Korea and Indochina, and in crises in the Taiwan Straits and elsewhere. Reagan right now is making nuclear threats in the Middle East when he warns the Russians that if they went into there, in the northern Iran, let's say, they would be facing a risk of World War III. And that would be World War III initiated by the U.S., since the Russians have a preponderance of non-nuclear strength in that area, which is, after all, on their borders, just as we would have a preponderance of non-nuclear strength in El Salvador, let's say, compared to the Russians, or Mexico, or the Dominican Republic. And yet we're trying to defend what we define as our interests in that area on their borders, just as if the Russians were trying to do it in Mexico, let's say. You can only attempt to do that with nuclear weapons. And that's what we are doing, but obviously at enormous risk. So the MX, which doesn't yet exist, but the Minuteman missiles, the Mark 12A warheads, are being used right now, this month, the way a gun is used when you hit someone's head in a crisis, in a confrontation, whether the trigger is pulled or not. That's why they buy the weapons. They've used them in the past, they're using them now, they expect to use them in the future. And yet, those past uses were in a day when the United States had virtually a monopoly of strategic nuclear force. Whatever one could say about the morality of making threats of mass destruction like that, one could say that the risk of it was very much less in those days than it is today in a world of Soviet parity with us and with other countries having nuclear weapons. So as the risks get higher, the threats keep getting made. And sooner or later, they'll have to be carried out. We'll be in an era of small nuclear wars, which will end eventually, whether it's a decade or a generation later or several generations. Will end with all the weapons going off. That's the most important way in which these weapons hurt our security. They encourage our leaders to persist nostalgically in threats that we first started making at a time when we had a monopoly of nuclear weapons. We've never gotten out of the habit. And it's a habit that will end life on Earth if we don't organize to transcend it. As humans, habits can be changed.
What about cross-use threats?
Well, the immediate issue is to stop the arms race, not to moderate its acceleration, as SALT was doing, but actually to adopt a bilateral freeze on the production, deployment, testing of any further nuclear weapons, Russian or American. The Russians have indicated a willingness to do that on a number of occasions. I mean, it's American presidents who've been the obstacle to that. They're not willing to cut off Russian weapons at the cost of accepting a halt on our own production, because they've always insisted on pursuing that superiority. Parity has not been enough for our foreign policy, as our leaders have seen it. They have to have superiority. That's because they've relied so much on first-use threats, on the threat of initiating nuclear war. To do that, you really want superiority. You can't have too many strategic weapons backing up a threat like that. The Russians don't rely on such threats. They don't have that need for superiority. They've been willing to accept parity. It's time for our public to tell our leaders they've been wrong. They are wrong. That parity is the only basis for stopping the arms race. That's the only basis for our security, followed, of course, by then bilateral and multilateral negotiations to reduce arms on all sides. Stopping is a first step. I would say an associated step of great importance is for the public to demand a commitment by our president, in law preferably, that the United States will under no circumstances use nuclear weapons first. Our preparations to use them first, our attempts to make that threat credible, are what keeps the arms race going. And unless we give up that threat, we won't see an end to it.
Do you perceive that we're in certain sense a unique juncture in history then?
Yes.
When like the historical mode of governments maintaining power has changed radically, because now no government can have a supremacy based on military power.
Well, their habits haven't changed. I'm saying their behavior isn't changing. It's just that the basis has fallen out. The idea that one can defend one's own borders now by military strength has simply been obsolete for 30 years, not for the United States, because early on there, our superiority, as I say, amounted to monopoly. It was so overwhelming. No country will ever have a superiority like that again. There's no way to buy it back. And from now on, all countries are more or less equally vulnerable to total annihilation. That really makes a mockery of all traditional notions of defense, but it doesn't change the habits of states overnight. And as Albert Einstein said, with the splitting of the atom, everything was changed except our ways of thinking. And so we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe.
How do we transcend that?
As humans, by changing. And I think the most profound change is not needed in the values of the public, which has a proper abhorrence for nuclear war in all countries, I think. But statesmen, I think, on the other hand, will have to be pressed by their own publics, starting in this country where we have more freedom to do that. They'll feel the heat before they see the light, as an old political expression. And we've got to put that pressure on them. Ultimately, they too will see the light.
Do you think then that the Soviet leadership then is more enlightened?
No. I have no indication of that at all. But their strategic position is different. Mainly, they've been used to being number two for so long. They haven't acquired vital strategic interests 10,000 miles from their shores or from their armies, as we've allowed ourselves to do in that 30 years of immense superiority, when we could think of a sphere of influence that extended right up to the Russian borders. The Russians have never been tempted to think in those terms, so they haven't acquired a set of military plans and preparations for such operations.
So you're saying it's quite unique for us to be overly paranoid that the Russian units along their border?
Paranoia, means two things. Clinically, it refers to excessive suspicion. On the one hand, fears and suspicions, and on the other hand, grandiloquence, feelings of immense power. And this unique possession of nuclear weapons for a long time, with the unique economic power that we had around the world, did create a kind of corruption of our leaders that other leaders, including even Russian, were simply not exposed to. They didn't have that kind of power. They're getting it now, to a degree. They'll never have the unchallenged power that we had. But I'm sure that there are stronger pressures for military buildup in Russia than there were 20 years ago, when they didn't have as big a military-industrial complex as they do today. That's not good.
That seems to be the crux of the Renaissance, because the lust for power. So,
yeah. And finally, to get back to your question, I think the antidote for that, really, is to confront them with the power of the people. They say a power that countervailing kind. In this country, we have the law on our side. We are the government, according to the Constitution. The public is sovereign. It's not true in other countries. Well, we can begin to ask on that.
How true is it in our country?
Well, it's not very true, especially in foreign policy. But in terms of our ability to inform ourselves and to act on that, it is truer than for any other country. I think the public played a more active and powerful role in ending the Vietnam War than was ever true in any other country conducting an imperial war. And it was much easier to do it in this country. That isn't to say it can't be done elsewhere. Even in Iran, even in Poland now, the power of unarmed people confronting their government has been shown to be enormous. But the risks they had to take were very great. In Iran, tens of thousands of people died in demonstrations at the hands of the Shah. We can demonstrate without facing machine guns yet. So we have that power, and we should be using it.
Do you see that as being the basic motivation for the action that the defendants took in this particular situation, in order to somehow ignite the power?
To wake people up. That I think they hoped that hammering that nose cone would make it ring like a bell and wake people up. Like a Liberty Bell, would free us from this dream of superior power, of military strength, that has so corrupted us. But it is a dream, it is an illusion, and we have the human ability to wake up from it. And they're playing an enormous role. I think we owe them a great debt for the price they're paying to do that, to give us the warning.
To what extent, Dr. Ellsberg, do you think that the nuclear position taken by our government is a reflection of our economic system?
Well, it reflects a very hierarchical system of power, which is the case with our capitalist system, but it's really also been the case with every other system the world has seen in the last 5,000 years of empire in major imperial powers. I don't actually think our imperial behavior is all that different from that of other empires before the age of capitalism. In each case, the leaders are expressing the desire to hold power, to increase their power, to maintain their power domestically, whatever that particular basis for that power is. In our case, of course, it is the connection with corporate power, with corporate interests in general. That's the basis for the main power structure in our country. I think Russian behavior in the satellites in Afghanistan and elsewhere is really very similar. And even when it's not recognized as such. And that doesn't come from capitalism. In other words, capitalism is certainly no cure for this power drive. On the contrary, it enforces it and drives it, just as other systems do. But I don't think it's unique. And the notion that we can get rid of it just, hard as that is, just by transcending capitalism is not enough, I don't think.
Then do you or do you not see the Soviet attitude on nuclear arms as being retaliatory, as being defensive?
Well, first of all, they've been very clearly number two, strikingly for the first 20 years of the arms race. They inevitably had to be defensive in that their ability to expand on the basis of nuclear threats was negligible in the face of the U.S. power on this. They do have parity now. And they insist that they want equal treatment. They want to be treated as an equal of the United States. That could have an ominous ring to it, in a sense, and I think with some validity. I think that indeed what they mean by that might be that they want to be as free to make pressures, to put pressure on non-nuclear powers, including their own satellites and their neighboring powers, as the United States has been. Not more so, maybe not quite as much. They're not building up the ability to project military strength, as the military puts it, thousands and thousands of miles away. They don't have the carriers, the amphibious force, the tactical air forces, and so forth. But I think they can aspire to being as tough, not only, let's say, on Afghanistan, but if Afghanistan gets supplies through Pakistan, what the United States would do in that situation is very clear. We would bomb Pakistan without any hesitation. We would bomb those routes, and we would threaten nuclear weapons. I don't rule out that the Soviet Union aspires to be able to do that same sort of thing in their own sphere of influence, without aspiring to as large a sphere of influence as we. In short, I don't think that the nuclear weapons, the existence of them, has abolished warfare, or aggression, or expansion on either side here. If we're just, and of course, there's more than two sides involved, actually. But anywhere you look, and I think that what the Russians did in Afghanistan, for all the rationales they can give for it, is very comparable to what we did in Vietnam. Given that these wars are going on and aggressions are, and that what we did in Vietnam was aggression. And what the Russians are doing in Afghanistan is aggression, clear-cut, if that word has any meaning at all. I think then that it's extremely urgent, in the light of the fact that such actions are going on in the world, that we take every effort to decouple them from the risk of nuclear war, whether initiated by ourselves, by the Russians, by anyone else. The greatest irresponsibility is to use the risk of nuclear war as an instrument of policy now, and to hook up the ongoing risks of revolts, counter-revolts, revolution, counter-revolution, aggression, defense, all of that, with the likelihood of nuclear operations and the possibility of escalation into a major nuclear war. That seems to me the most urgent task facing us right now, and I think a practical one that the people of the world would be strongly supporting. And yet we find the leaders constantly making these threats. I'm going to have to leave.
Thanks. Thank you.